Alright, to save you guys time, we put all of the previews in one video separated by chapters so you can hop to whatever boss you want. So here's a quick preview of every boss in Amirdrassil, the Dream's Hope. The full raid guides are coming out soon, so check out our Patreon to get early access to those and to also help support the channel. To kick things off, we first start with Gnarlroot, the first boss of the raid. It's a pretty simple boss with two alternating phases. In phase 1, the boss spawns a bunch of these inactive adds and you have to activate some of them by dropping these circle debuffs on top of them, otherwise they all become active at the same time going into phase 2, and that's not ideal. In phase 2, the boss goes immune and grows a bunch of these roots around the room. To break his immunity, you have to soak these circles that spawn around the room and then run into all of the roots to burn them. Once they're all burned, the boss takes double damage for like 20 seconds while also pulsing a crazy amount of raid damage and then starts phase 1 again. Now on to boss 2, Igiria the Cruel. This boss has one phase. She throws spears at players that keep them in a pool of fire until the spear is killed by the raid. At full energy, she marks 3 weapons around the room and makes you choose which weapon you want her to fight with. The raid has to stand on the weapon and soak some of the damage to get her to choose it, and then she casts the weapon's ultimate ability a couple of times. One of them has a big group soak on the tank that you have to alternate half of the raid soaking each time, and then dispel a bunch of stuns on anyone who's soaked. One has big circles to dodge that she leaps to and then does raid damage, and one has healing absorbs on the whole raid that have to be healed off in time or else they explode. Once you pick one weapon, you can't pick it again, so you do have to deal with all of them eventually. And once you run out of weapons to pick, she gets real mad and you're dead. For boss 3, Volcoross, random players get targeted with circle debuffs and should spread out to minimize damage. A big tail slams the ground showing a shadow beforehand. Avoid this shadow to prevent getting one-shot by the slam. It's actually pretty creepy to see this for the first time. At full energy, the boss spawns 2 big group soaks. You'll need to split the raid in half to soak them both. These soaks drop a big patch of fire on the ground, and when the boss reaches full energy again, the soaks appear on the other side of each fire, meaning the raid should stay split in half and battle the boss from opposite sides of the room for the majority of the fight. Eventually, the entire room fills up with fire from the soaks, and you'll end up with nowhere safe to go, and you're dead. The fourth boss is the Council of Dreams. There's 3 bosses, each with their unique abilities and mechanics that all work together, creating a super fun and complex boss fight. You'll be facing Urktos, Erwin, and Pip, and the goal is to try to kill them around the same time to prevent them from rezzing, which is actually made a little bit harder because Urktos the bear is movable while the other 2 just jump around randomly. So Urktos has a charge that goes through the tank. Some of the raid needs to stand in its path each time to mitigate the raid-wide damage at the end of the charge. Erwin spawns poison flowers all over the place that do big raid damage to anyone standing in them. And Pip polymorphs random players into ducks, which then need to run through some of the poison flowers on the ground to eat them and get the ability to unduck themselves. These regular abilities interact with each of the boss's full energy cast. Urktos does a big raid-wide channel which you have to interrupt by having one of the ducks remove their polymorph on top of him. Erwin does a big raid-wide channel which you can interrupt by making sure an Urktos charge passes through her. And Pip puts a damage absorb on everyone that you have to break in time by standing in the poison flowers for a couple of seconds. Now, Zax is a big fan of fights that have interacting mechanics like this, so this one's definitely 2 thumbs up from him, and I also have to agree with that. This fight looks super fun. Now, moving on to the 5th boss, Larodar, Keeper of the Flame. Larodar is actually the boss that comes after Volcoross and has 2 phases. This boss is a little funky and has a million mechanics, but once you get the general idea, it's actually not too hard to execute. In phase 1, the main goal is to spawn a shield that the raid needs to then stand in before the boss gets to full energy and one-shots the raid. And there's quite a few steps to spawning a shield, so brace yourself. You have to kill some Trent adds, then heal them to full, and then keep healing them as they energize the seed in the middle of the room. Then, once some fixating roots spawn, click the seed to start breathing life energy in front of you and aim it at the roots to make them targetable. Then, kill the roots, heal them to full, and then finally spawn a shield. Super simple and not overly complicated at all. It's actually pretty easy to execute when you're doing it. Otherwise, there's also a charge that the tanks need to run away from the raid, and some fire orbs to soak before they get to the boss. Once the boss gets to 40% or gets to full energy for the 3rd time, he channels massive raid damage for a few seconds and then starts phase 2. This phase is much simpler. There's little circles to soak to keep them from blowing up on the raid, heal absorbs on random players that have to be taken out of the raid, and finally a pretty funky tank mechanic. The boss casts a frontal cone that applies a debuff which makes you unhealable. You can only leech health from players around you in a small circle. Yeah, good luck getting people to stay in that circle. So for boss number 6, Nymue, Weaver of the Cycle, we actually had to do a quick mic change because the boss had some significant last minute changes from Blizzard. Nymue is another out of order boss that comes after Council, and it's got 2 alternating phases. In phase 1, there's these wispy smoky lines on the ground that give you a stack of a short dot debuff when you touch them, but other mechanics in the fight force you to sometimes have to run through them. The main one being these flowers that spawn all over the room. They all pulse raid-wide damage and players have to stand on them to get them to shrink over time and disappear. There's also green beams to dodge that slowly move out from the boss, which stun and damage anyone they hit. And the only heroic change in this phase is that there's some extra debuffs you have to take out of the raid. At full energy, the boss starts phase 2. It goes immune and spawns 2 adds on opposite sides of the room that your raid has to split up and kill to be able to hit the boss again. But first, the tanks have to soak a circle around the boss in order to get the buff that lets everyone behind them run through the lines on the ground without taking any damage. Then each side can follow their tank to their add. The adds on either side don't do anything too special, just a random cone to dodge and some swirlies, but you absolutely cannot move them across any of the lines on the ground or else you're dead. And once the adds are dealt with, it's back to phase 1 and back to the regular mic. And now we're moving on to the final 3. So Smolderon is the 7th boss of the raid and has 2 alternating phases. In phase 1, half of the raid gets little circles around them that pulse AoE damage and force them to spread out for a few seconds. And at the same time, there's a group soak on the tank that the other half of the raid has to soak, which puts a big healing absorb on them, as well as a debuff that you actually want to have for phase 2. This happens twice each phase, so everyone will end up soaking and having a debuff. At full energy, the boss runs to the middle of the room and starts phase 2, spawning random patterns of these fire rings for everyone to dodge. Anyone that has a debuff from soaking in phase 1 also spawn a few little orbs around them that move toward the boss. Each player has to run into their own orb to soak them and prevent them from getting to the boss and buffing him. And the orbs give stacks of a big damage and healing buff. Then it's back to phase 1. I told you we're keeping these previews short. Gotta do another mic change. The penultimate boss is Tindral Sageswift, Seer of the Flame. This is the boss right after Smolderon. It has 3 phases with a couple of Dragonflight intermissions between them. In every phase of the fight, the main thing the boss does is cast a mass root on the entire raid that spawns vines that you can then kill to break free of the root, which you'll probably end up just grouping around the boss and AoEing everything down. And then there's a few mechanics that you need to move for, which makes getting out of these roots quickly super important, like random swirlies on the ground, a debuff you have to dispel that drops fire on the ground, and the tank mechanic that spawns circles around the boss that do a ton of damage. Phase 1 also has big fire tornadoes to dodge. Phase 2 has seeds on the ground that everyone needs to run over to prevent them from growing into a tree that wipes the raid. And Phase 3 has both of Phase 1 and 2 mechanics on top of everything else. The intermission after Phase 1 and 2 are the big memorable parts though. The boss flies away toward the next platform, leaving everyone a feather that they can run over and use to be able to dragon ride after the boss. On the way over there are some fire orbs to dodge and some green orbs that the raid can spread out and collect to get a big damage buff. Once the boss lands, he starts a long raid wiping cast and you have to nuke him to break his shield and interrupt the cast. It's actually a pretty cool way to incorporate dragonflying in a fight. And back to the regular mic. So for Fyrakk, he's the last boss of the raid, and we usually make a prediction guide, but the prediction guide takes like 30 hours between Zax and I, so that video is gonna probably be up pretty quickly after this one. It's probably already out for early access anyway, so check the description, and if not, it'll be out in a few days. If you made it this far into the video, then you might be able to help us. We're heavily considering making a newsletter every month that goes a little deeper into the guides, our process, big news that's happening in World of Warcraft and in Blizzard, as well as other tips and suggestions on gamer life and stuff like that. This is like a monthly or bi-weekly type newsletter thing, email newsletter. So if you're thinking you'd be interested in that, you can sign up with the link in the description. It's absolutely free. There's no spam, no bullshit. It's just helpful stuff that comes in your inbox once or twice a month. Now also, what do you think about my Lion King cup? I think it's pretty sweet. Come to the Discord if you want to say hello. I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace. Don't give a shit. What? Always give a fuck.